I'm Rob Forsyth and welcome to Liberalism in Question. This CIS podcast looks into issues around classical liberalism, its strengths, its weaknesses and challenges. Normally on Liberalism in Question, if you've been able to watch any of the other podcasts, you know we talk about ideas and challenges. But today I want to talk about something a little more serious, about where fighting for liberalism is personally very, very costly. The person I'd like to have here on the show is Jimmy Lai. Jimmy Lai is a businessman in Hong Kong. He's in jail in Hong Kong. That's why I've got Jimmy Lai's son Sebastian, welcome, and also international lawyer coming to Australia with Sebastian, Caoilfhionn Gallagher, welcome.
Thank you.
Who is Jimmy Lai?
Jimmy, my father, was the publisher of the biggest newspaper in Hong Kong. He founded that after Tiananmen Square.
After Tiananmen Square, he founded a newspaper. In reaction?
That's correct, yes. So in reaction to Tiananmen Square, originally he had founded a clothing brand called Giordano, which I believe is also in Australia. And that was growing very quickly and very successful. But his political awakening came when the Tiananmen Square massacre happened, which...
Back in 1984, if I remember.
1989.
89,
yeah,
I'm old.
Dating yourself.
Yeah.
He really thought that he needed to stand up for the freedoms of Hong Kong, stand up for these values, the rule of law, free press, that he knew that once Hong Kong went back to Chinese hands, weren't going to be respected. And so he founded a newspaper with the idea that information is
okay,
truth,
let me get this
information is
now.
choice, and choice is freedom.
Now, Hong Kong was a British Crown colony.
Exactly, yeah.
Which meant that, although it wasn't independent, it nonetheless had many values and institutions from Great Britain.
Yeah, yeah.
And therefore, basically liberal institutions. You said the rule of law, free press.
Free press, yeah, yeah.
Was it elected government?
So there was no elected chief executive,
right?
But the Hong Kong Parliament. Well,
there was a parliament.
There was a parliament.
Well, there was a parliament.
Yeah,
still,
yeah.
yes.
And part of those people are elected. Yeah.
And Hong Kong. Your father actually was a refugee from mainland China to Hong Kong.
Right? Yeah. So he arrived when he was 12 on the bottom of a fishing boat.
And he was a self-made man.
Self-made. Yeah.
He started with nothing and became.
Exactly. He look. I think this idea of being self-made is something that we will say that he definitely was self-made. But for him, the reason why he could be so successful was because of the freedoms of Hong Kong.
Because institutional freedoms of Hong Kong.
Exactly.
And that's true. I think that's what we're going to find out, that although individualism is part of a liberal understanding, it's not. Institutions are just as important.
You need the foundations.
And he obviously, in this time, while doing his clothing business, developed a love of the kind of freedoms that even a crown colony could provide, a British crown colony could provide.
Right. Because he had come from China. Yeah. So he had come from communist China, which his father had escaped when the communists came. His mother was put in a re-educational camp. And so he knew the stark contrast. And he always says that even though the first day he arrived to Hong Kong, he immediately went to work in a glove factory as a child laborer, he felt like he was in heaven because he finally had hope. He knew that he had a future.
Just pause our discussion of Jimmy, we can go back to a bigger picture question. Yeah. One of the issues we often talk about here on Liberalism in Question is liberalism a uniquely Western phenomenon, or does it also have purchase in non-Western cultures? Now, in a way, Hong Kong is a Western culture at one level because it's British institutions. But there's a sense in which you're saying Chinese people are just as interested in liberty as anyone else.
I mean, I think Ronald Reagan puts it very well that, and I'm paraphrasing him from his speech, but he essentially says, the freedom and democracy aren't the sole prerogative of a chosen few; they're the right of all of God's children.
Right. Is there a tradition in China? You might not know this answer, but is there a tradition in China of liberal democracy or liberal society?
So there wasn't until there is, essentially, right? Okay. Like all over the world.
Okay. Your dad arrives in Hong Kong. He starts off in you say glove factory?
Yep, glove factory. That's correct.
But by the freedoms he has and his own energy, and we'll come back to who he is, he becomes a good businessman. Tiananmen Square occurs in 1989,
Yeah,
and he reacts by becoming a newspaper producer.
that's correct. Yeah, yeah. And he was originally he was dismissed because obviously my father, having escaped when he was 12, only had a grade 5 education. One of the people that I know that reads the most. So very, very well read.
Your dad is well read.
Incredibly well read. He read all of Frederick Hayek's work,
right.
which he actually I remember that he was telling me that the first time he read Road to Serfdom, didn't understand it, so he read it 10 times, and that's how he finally understood the text.
Oh my goodness me! What a man of determination. We'll come back to that in a moment. Obviously, a very determined man.
Yeah.
So not just liberal in the general sense, but actually embracing, you may call it liberal economics.
Yeah. So it really was that this awakening. He went to work in the U.S. in his 20s as a salesman for a factory in
Right.
Hong Kong, and that's where he really developed intellectually as well as
How interesting.
yeah his beliefs on economics.
Now tell me about his newspaper. It's called the Apple Daily.
Yeah, it was called Apple Daily.
Why Apple, by the way, you know?
So it's very interesting that you asked that, Bishop, because it refers to the Garden of Eden. For him, the Garden of Eden was Adam and Eve, they ate the apple and then was thrown out of the Garden of Eden. But so it was tongue in cheek because his point was that China was not heaven. And so as a person living in that illusion, you had to bite the apple, you had to eat the apple every day. And he believed that that's how you gain truth, and with truth you had choice, and choice with freedom.
So it was a slightly provocative title.
Exactly.
Based upon a misreading of the scripture, by the way. It doesn't say it's an apple at all.
I know.
It says it's the tree of the knowledge of fruit, but we're not here to talk theology, so we won't do that.
Yeah.
So he called Apple Daily. So was he, I want to trade on this in a minute. He was a Christian believer as well?
Yeah, so he became Catholic in 97.
I'll come back to a moment with how that affected his life.
Yeah.
So the Apple Daily, what was the Apple Daily?
So the Apple Daily was what became the largest newspaper in Hong Kong. So next magazine, Apple Daily, it was the largest newspaper in Hong Kong. But what made it important was that it also had a pro-democracy. It was incredibly pro-democracy in its editorial and essentially everything it did. So it was always a thorn in the Chinese government side and the Hong Kong government side because they switched power, wasn't afraid.
Even the Hong Kong government power when it was still a British Crown colony.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it was always incredibly.
So he's at this slightly annoying, determined, believer in freedom, liberty. Even the British government or British Crown colony is not entirely happy with him. And then comes Tiananmen Square. Then comes the changeover, which was
97.
97. That's right. 10 years after, 9 years after, 8 years after Tiananmen Square. Now, how did Hong Kongers think, and what did he feel it was going to be like? Was it with dread or with hope? How did you face the fact that the Chinese Communist government, effectively, because the party and the state are meshed in Communist China, how did they feel about that remarkable potential loss of freedom?
So, obviously the people of Hong Kong were incredibly afraid of that.
Right.
My father was one of the people who decided to do something about that and use his money and ability to do something. And that's why he started the media.
So got involved in greater media once the Chinese government took over.
Well, it was Apple Daily. They just kept running, kept going.
Many Hong Kong Chinese people left Hong Kong. There are many here in Australia, but not your father.
No, he did not. I don't think he. I think he felt like he had a responsibility to his adoptive home, having known how it was.
Yes, of course.
In China.
Now, what were things like to start with the change of regime, the one country, two systems theory?
Yeah. So, frankly, it was one country, two system until 2020. I mean, the institutions started breaking down a bit before that time, but yeah, it was one country, two system, and the rule of law, the free press, was by and large respected in Hong Kong, and it was very interesting because it was a good way to see how China viewed the liberties that we have here in Australia.
Why did it change?
I don't
Do you know?
necessarily want to speculate, but it was as a reaction to the pro-democracy protests of 2019.
Okay, we'll go back. Why were there pro-democracy protests?
I think the people of Hong Kong. So in the joint declaration when Hong Kong went back to China, it was agreed upon that Hong Kong would be able to elect its own leaders. And so that was always something that was a point of contention. And Hong Kong, though it had all these other freedoms, it did not have that freedom of an elected leader, a leader that was accountable to the people. And so you had the umbrella movements in 2014.
So, under the British, there was no elected leader.
Yeah.
But the agreement of the Communist China takeover was there would be one. That was the agreement.
Yeah.
And this didn't happen.
This did not happen.
And so the Chinese, the Hong Kongers, feisty Hong Kongers, wanted that.
Exactly, yeah.
And started protesting or asking for that.
Yeah. Exactly, which is, I think we'd all agree something that democracies are something that, freedom is something that people are entitled to.
And you call it the Umbrella Revolution because...
So in 2014 it was called the Umbrella Revolution because the police started using tear gas and pepper spray, and in order to protect themselves, the students used umbrellas.
Right. 2014.
And then 2019 it happened again as a result of a extradition law that they wanted to pass.
That's the one. There was a law which meant you could be extradited to Communist China.
Yeah, that's correct.
Obviously the Chinese government was anxious about this. Perhaps they were fearful of another, after having had Tiananmen Square, they wanted it never to happen again. And the collapse of the Soviet Union, I think, really spooked them, is my impression.
Right.
How did they respond to this demand for, A, your own elected leader, and two, not to have extradition laws to the mainland?
So they, I think they made a very clear decision to remove the rule of law from Hong Kong, and their way of doing that is national security law, which essentially is a hammer to the legal system. Now,
this is important to understand because in Australia we're so used to the rule of law, we think it's somehow a natural thing. It's not, because it's a quite arbitrary thing. The rule of law is that even the government has to keep even the party in power has to obey the rule. There's a distinction between the judiciary, even though they can drive us mad sometimes, and the elected representatives. And although they make the laws, once the laws are made, we're all under the same law. That's the rule of law. Now you're saying that was, what did the Communist Party, Communist Chinese want to change about that? How is it different now?
Well, I mean, I'm sure Keelan could add to that as well, but
we've got a lawyer on hand.
Exactly. So with the national security law, it sits above our legal system, which basically means that you could get arrested for a number of offences, including liking a tweet or
liking a tweet.
Yeah, liking a tweet, liking a social media post, or in Dad's case, journalism.
I'll ask Keelan, how is the national security law, what do you mean? What does it mean? Sits above the rule of law? I don't understand.
Yeah, so the national security law was imposed in 2020 by Beijing on Hong Kong.
I understand that. They said this is now the law in your part.
Absolutely, and more recently, Hong Kong now has a homegrown version as well. Very recently, in the last few months. But the national security law was condemned by a very wide range of United Nations experts, quite rightly, as undermining the rule of law and posing a real risk to civil society in Hong Kong. And that included, for example, the UN Special Rapporteur on independence of judges and lawyers. It included UN Special Rapporteur on counter-terrorism, freedom of expression, and so on. And one of the real concerns with the national security law is it essentially criminalises dissent. It's drafted in a breathtakingly broad way. Its offences are extremely broad, and it applies to anyone on the planet, whether they've ever set foot in Hong Kong or not. It applies extraterritorially. It's not just within Hong Kong.
I understand that.
Anywhere.
So what it does is it criminalises a whole range of potential actions which in a rule of law state would not be criminalised. So it's the breach, the reach of the law is what the problem is.
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
one of the problems.
One
of the other problems is that actually ultimately the power rests back in Beijing. So there was a very clear example of that during Jimmy Lai's case, where Jimmy Lai had a choice of lawyer who he wanted to run his case within Hong Kong, the domestic trial. And in fact, he won an argument in the Hong Kong courts to that effect. And then the chief executive, then objected. So the Hong Kong authorities then took the case, and it got taken over. And in Beijing, Beijing overrode that.
So rather than the law, the judiciary running its own life, the executive comes and says, no, you do it this way.
Exactly.
Okay.
And also, it's completely open to interpretation by the.
I understand the very vagueness is part of its power.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's part of these kind of laws. So this law comes in. Now, your father had been a leader of the pro-democracy movement, or a loud voice in it. But
yeah, exactly.
Leader's not the right word.
Yeah.
I was interested. Your father was a Christian believer, a Catholic, and I vaguely remember hearing that some of the protest songs in 2020 were actually Christian choruses.
Yeah. Hong Kong was.
What's going on there?
So Hong Kong is a very Catholic
Right.
island, and the view of doing right by both your people, but also by God was something that I believe many Hong Kong people wanted to do, and that pushed them to call for freedom. Push isn't the right word, but it basically meant that they felt a moral responsibility to call for freedom and democracy, and because of that, the two feelings became intertwined.
Right. I mean, one of the great questions about liberalism is, can it exist without some sense of a transcendent authority above the state? And I know that the communist Chinese view is there is no transcendent authority above the state, even potentially. In a secular Western society, liberalism does not commit itself to any theological propositions, but it allows the possibility. It allows the possibility for such a thing normally. That's very interesting. So it was not just the experience of freedom, there was also a sense of transcendent sense of we have an obligation, morality beyond that of these people telling us what to do. So what happened to your father?
So my father was arrested at the end of 2020. They took him to his offices, where 200 police officers had just raided the newsrooms.
Yes.
And sort of paraded him around like a criminal, and then he's been in jail since the end of 2020.
Had your father had a chance to get out before then? Surely he must have seen this coming.
Yeah, for the last 30 years, he made a very clear
30
decision.
years?
Yeah, I mean, he started doing this in being pro-democratic, having a free speech since 89 essentially.
So your father saw that the significant possibility of what's happening.
Yeah. Entirely so, and that's why I think I think that's why it's such an incredible story, because he's a man who had every opportunity to get out, and not even get out. If you know, with these autocratic regimes, it's really a carrot or the stick system, and he chose the stick because he felt like it was the right thing to do to by himself, by the people of Hong Kong, by his adoptive home, and indeed by God.
So he had the chance to get out. He refused to leave for the sake of his people and the sake of his God.
Yeah.
I don't know if you know the name of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a German theologian in the 1930s, was in New York, but deliberately went back to Germany after the Nazi takeover to be with his people, and eventually lost his life. Kind of a very brave and courageous man. Many would not have done what your father did. They would have said, put my life, I'd rather live than be imprisoned, and perhaps worse, for the sake of liberty.
Yeah, I think, look, in life you choose what you live for and you choose what you fight for. And for my father, it really was democracy and the freedom of Hong Kong. And, as you alluded to, he could have left at any point. But I think once you make that decision to forsake your beliefs, then you almost live as a shell of yourself. Also, he knew that if he had left, the blowback on his staff and the people of Hong Kong would have potentially been much
So by
stronger.
being there, he was actually protecting them as well.
Yeah, exactly.
I got a quote. He once said, "Fear is the chief weapon they have." Speaking of the Chinese Communist government, he refused to be bowed by fear.
Yeah, exactly. Because obviously everybody everybody feels fear, but he refused for that to be his guiding.
You were going to say something. I noticed you.
He gave, there's a really powerful interview which he gave to the New York Times in 2019, and it's very similar to the quote that you've just given, where he was describing how in 2019 so many businessmen in Hong Kong who were asked by the authorities to back the authorities did so out of fear. And he said, it's a mistake, because once they cow you, they can always cow you. Once they have you in their pocket, they always have you in their pocket. And he refused to be cowed and refused to be put in the authorities' pocket, because he's a man of deep principle who has always been driven by a desire to do the right thing. Right. And he's always been driven by this deep sense of principle and belief in what's right.
What a remarkable man. And he's not young, if I may say so.
76.
That's not young anymore. I say that myself. He's been in prison since the last 4 years now. This is recorded in 2024. What's going to happen? What's going on?
Yeah, so he has his national security law trial now, finally, after being delayed.
So there's a trial going on.
There's a trial going on, yes. The trial has judges appointed by the government, no jury, a chief of security of Hong Kong that essentially alluded to my father being guilty even before the start of the trial.
Say what's that? He alluded?
Yes, so before the start of the trial.
We get this sometimes in newspapers in Australia, but we don't get it from chief executives.
And not necessarily by the chief of security.
No, we don't.
Yeah.
So we get it from TV personalities and newspapers, but not from the chief.
Not from a government.
No, not from a government.
Right. Yeah, so unfortunately that's what he stands, that's what he's facing against. And there's a maximum sentence of life imprisonment under the national security law. But at his age, even 5 to 10 years could pretty much be the same thing.
Yes. So it's almost a foregone conclusion, you believe? I'm sorry to put it, that's bad news. But
so it's almost a foregone conclusion that he will be found guilty.
That's what I mean.
Now, I don't believe that is a foregone conclusion that he will pass away in prison, which is why I'm doing what I'm doing now.
You're going around the world with your legal help and others in order to do what?
To get attention on my father's case, to put pressure on the Hong Kong government to release my father.
See, liberal democracies, where there's the rule of law, you can get somewhere. Occasionally you can get somewhere with autocracies if there's something in it for them. We in Australia had recently a couple of people returned. It's part of a pantomime about changing government relationships and so forth. Why do you have hope in the sake of Jimmy Lai?
So this is quite interesting, actually, and I'm sure a lot of your audience will be able to help with that pressure, is that the Hong Kong government is trying to tell the rest of the world that they still have the rule of law and the free press. I mean, if you Google Apple Daily raids, they raided it twice. The second time they sent 500 people and arrested some of my father's colleagues as well. You'll see that is just a barefaced lie. They're essentially telling you that you should, all the other countries, that you should take money and just be willfully ignorant or even shut up. And so putting pressure on them and telling them that you're not going to accept this.
So you believe the present Hong Kong administration is telling the story that? What's their story?
That it is still a good place to do business, that it's still a financial centre, that is they still have the rule of law and the free press.
So they're claiming to have the rule of law and free press, and you're saying this is not true.
I mean, I'm not saying that's
it is not true. I mean, I'm saying.
Yeah.
I know the other day, at the time of recording, MasterChef Australia was on for 2024, and you wouldn't have seen it coming from America, but they had 3 sessions in Hong Kong with wonderful Cantonese cooking and so forth. But the whole thing was, I thought, a remarkable puff piece for Hong Kong. There was no sense that there was anything question mark. Why would there be? They're getting all this money from Cathay Pacific, whatever. And you're here to say that's not true anymore. There's a problem which can't be overlooked.
Yeah, entirely so.
Well, why would not be in the Chinese government's interest to not prosecute your father and say, why is a 76-year-old man worth all this trouble? Then again, I can't judge, but it occurred to me, if that's the message they want to give, why are they acting against their own best interest?
No, I completely agree. It is in their best interest to release my father and for Hong Kong to be a financial centre where...
Yes, but my question is, I understand, if I was presidency, I'd be doing the same thing, but there's obviously an anxiety, a fear, a paranoia or something. Can you add to that?
Yeah, so I think it was a wrong-headed decision. And I think the reality of that decision is now coming, they're now seeing it. And right. I think certainly there's a growing awareness in Beijing that what's happened here is actually very harmful to them. So look, Chief Executive John Lee in Hong Kong, in his first policy speech after he was appointed, gave a speech which was all about the return of international investment, how much they want the international community to invest and do business in Hong Kong. He wants the world to return post-COVID. We saw how many people the Chinese sent to Davos this year. Their delegation was absolutely huge. They've been going to state visits in multiple places. Obviously had the Chinese premier here, pushing a particular message very recently. So what they're saying repeatedly is that Hong Kong is a place where you're safe, you're welcome. There's even a whole campaign called Hello Hong Kong, trying to encourage people to return. And what we are trying to get home to them at the moment is that by continuing to persecute Jimmy Lai...
And others, by the way. There are others too, I've noticed.
Of course, there's 1,841 political prisoners in Hong Kong. And if I may, just as you've mentioned that, in 2019, in June 2019, there were 29 political prisoners in Hong Kong. And the most recent figures available for April 2024, the figure is 1,841. Now, 29 to 1,841 in a 5-year period is a 7,000% increase. And that puts Hong Kong in terrible company, puts it in the company of Belarus, Myanmar, and Cuba. That's it. So that's the territory that you're now in. So Hong Kong, on the one hand, is trying to present itself as still being the beacon in the region, a free trade, a free press hub, in the way that it was years ago. But actually, the reality is very, very different. And what we now need to do is we need to ensure that we don't have faith in Hong Kong or indeed Beijing doing the right thing for the right reasons and releasing Jimmy Lai because it's the right thing to do. But we think they might do the right thing for the wrong reasons, which is because it's simply not in their own self-interest.
So you'll take the consolation prize if you can get it.
We'll take the consolation prize.
You can get it, yes.
Well, key thing is, current situation is Sebastian is not able to return to Hong Kong safely because of the work he's doing, campaigning for his father. He himself has been threatened with criminal prosecution simply for speaking out for his father, for taking actions like going to the United Nations, for example. So at the moment, the position is Sebastian hasn't been able to see his father since 2020. On the current trajectory, if the Hong Kong authorities get their way, he will never see his father again, to put it starkly. That's why it's so important the international community tries to change that trajectory and ensure that this brave, brilliant man is released and can be reunited with his son.
Is it safe for me to go to Hong Kong, for anyone to go to Hong Kong?
So I guess it depends what else you say in this interview. If you're,
I may have blown my chance to get another custom-made suit.
Yeah.
Well,
essentially.
My short answer is no.
Yeah.
My view is Hong Kong is now one of those places where you are taking your life in your hands if you go there. And there's some very stark examples of that. So you have a high-profile, the most high-profile prisoner of all in Jimmy Lai, but you also see a whole range of other people who've been prosecuted under the national security law for ludicrous things. Booksellers, children's book authors, for example. We've had a situation where a student who was studying in Japan returned to Hong Kong during half term and got arrested because of material she'd liked on social media. So if you like posts from Amnesty International or you like posts which criticise the authorities in Hong Kong or Beijing, you can be in real difficulty. And I suspect even by having this conversation with us, you could be in real difficulty. Given how vague the national security law is, that's the whole point of it. They can get anyone that they wish to.
Well, I never thought liberalism in question would be such a dangerous profession.
No, because they're questioning it.
But the key point, however, and we need to bring this to an end, is that people like your father are people who are prepared to put their lives on the line for liberty. Even if the chances of success are not looking good, right? And we need those people in order to preserve a society and a country and a world in which there is freedom. And so I guess we need to honour him, whatever the situation. We're very sorry to hear about the situation and wish you all the best in your campaign. There's been another one of our podcasts in our Liberalism in Question series. I'm Rob Forsyth. Thank you for watching.